So what we'll do is we'll crack on with the second learning outcome, and there are a few slides that we're going to cover with regards to this. So what I've done is I've opened that up and just a recap, in terms of what we covered yesterday. So yesterday we basically understood, the concept of talent management, and we looked at some definitions by some, let's put it this way, research which has been done over the years, and how talent management as a field has evolved within the the overall sector of human resources management, and how talent management can be clearly differentiated in terms of its role as a process, and in terms of what it enables, in terms of the various components from the human resource planning side of things. So sometimes it is, let me put it this way, sometimes it is easy for people to, confuse that the human resources functions are similar to what the talent management functions are. But in the first learning outcome, we were able to clearly establish that talent management goes beyond the scope of just human resources functions and planning, and it basically deals with situation once the candidate or the let's put it this way, people are recruited in the organization after the selection has been done, and it is more focused on things like succession planning, retention, high quality employees, and to look at things like efficiency and productivity, and how some of the things, as an example we looked at was, when I say incentives, rewards, which are basically for performance, but when we look at that under talent management, they become things like compensation, or for example, become compensation, and the word actually changes to looking at rewards. So incentive, bonus, perks, actually at the initial level, when the employee is new to the organization, when the employee is recruited, you get a standard contract which has things like incentives, perks, and other associated benefits. But after you work in the organization for a number of years and you are experienced and you are a key part of the organizational team, then from an aspect of talent management, it looks at basically looking at differentiating in terms of compensation and rewards. So we looked at the option of stocks, which a lot of senior management colleagues get in large organizations. And this concept, emerges primarily in companies or businesses or organizations where you have a large number of employees. The business is predominantly global, and in most circumstances, there is this specialist function which is required within HRM to be able to deal with quality employees, to retain them, to train them, and to look at performance and overall productivity issues, which are then matched with the strategic direction of the organization. So talent management, in terms of a strategy, also ties into the organizational strategy. But when we look at recruitment and selection, that also ties in with the recruitment, the organizational strategy, but at the initial levels. And this thing would look at tying into the vision and mission of the organization or the business, but from a very long-term perspective, because sometimes you have to look at employees as resources, and then these resources are, headhunted, or these resources are, seeked. When I say, again, I will go back to the slide which basically says acquisition of these resources has to happen over a point in time. And we discussed a brief example of, Apple, and how the head of retail operations and, was actually headhunted from Burberry, where she was a CEO, but she now leads the retail initiative at Apple, and that is under the effect of, under the direct, influence of something called talent acquisition, because they look out for candidates in this area, and then go after, after them in terms of, when I say literally not go after them, but basically look at sourcing them, bringing them into the company, but they employ recruitment agencies and, elaborate processes, and sometimes this transition takes a period of time. So it does not happen in a month, 2 months, it takes 6 to 12 months, 18 months, and that is where the acquisition of this talent then comes in. Now, in the second learning outcome, we are going to be focused on understanding what are the challenges which are involved when you look at managing talent. So when I say talent, what we are looking at basically saying is people within the organization which are performing, which are productive, which the organization wants to retain, and these employees in particular would be treated as something as an asset within the organization. So they are an asset for the department, an asset for the organization, because if they end up leaving, it can lead to a direct loss of revenue or other forms of direct loss to the organization in terms of productivity, maybe in terms of targets or in terms of market share, or in terms of loss, not just in form of information and sometimes quantifiable things like revenue and target, but also in terms of the experience and the information which the candidate or the person has gained over the years, which becomes vitally important for a business to sustain and a business to maintain and grow going forward. So we look at some of the challenges and we look at understanding the key factors which are taken into account when we look at managing this talent or managing people who are highly desired, sought after for the organization. We look at some barriers. What are barriers to global talent management? Because that we are living increasingly in a very global world which is connected, and because of the effects of immigration, diversity, companies having global operations or operations in different countries, it is easy for the talent to also be acquired, and they also move from one company to the other. So we look at the barriers, which HR department or the person who's looking at managing this within the organization faces. And last but not the least, we look at the role of, how immigration or how, for example, mobility of the highly skilled labor or, highly skilled people is happening across countries, and why it poses a particular challenge to, looking at when people have to manage talent within an organization. So the first slide that I put forward, is a pictureless, or is a slide which has a bit of a picture or a diagram on it. And here it highlights what are the talent management practices which companies tend to employ. Now, the outer circle that you see is what we discussed yesterday, that this is where the key aspect of talent management actually, comes in. So when we look at performance management, retention, compensation and rewards, you look at review, you look at recruitment, selection, and training and development. Now, these are all factors which are required at some point in time to be, working with in order for the person to be retained within the organization. So sometimes you will see that a lot of key senior people undergo training on, say, media or handling, press. Now, if you see, mostly in all organizations, the press conferences are dealt with by the senior management or somebody who's in the CXO kind of position, Chief Operating Officer, or, for example, Chief Executive Officer. And those people sometimes receive what is called, they undergo, and with experience, they undergo, they learn a lot of things, but with experience, they learn how to handle press questions, and, the media. So even at that level, you will see that development and training is required, and that is given to certain set of employees which are given that responsibility of managing PR or press or, press interviews for the organization. They are nominated as key spokesperson. So when you look at this as a process, the outer periphery of this particular picture, what we see are basically tools which are used by, somebody who's managing talent to be able to look at, working with the people with these tools and techniques to manage that. Now, when we get into the inner side, how do we look at that talent management works within an organization? So here, if we look at something called the guiding principles, now what we will see is that there are a number of factors which basically influence this, and that is how this department or this particular function actually takes shape within an organization. Now, some of the guiding principles are that if the businesses become, let's look at certain businesses. So when you look at people within key positions within business, what they tend to do is they have management responsibility, or they have responsibility for a number of people in terms of, managing not just the tasks, but also ensuring that those, the targets are met. So they are in a matrix structure, wherein what we get to see is that this structure allows them to not only get work done, but also achieve, something called strategic targets which are set by the organization. So one of the key things why we see talent management happening within an organization is that there is a management buy-in or an involvement at a very high level, and they tend to identify that these people are to be looked at from an aspect of career development, from an aspect of let's put it this way, to be able to be groomed into moving to higher positions or take up higher positions of responsibility within the organization. So management's involvement is a must. Now, if you look at a small business, you might have an HR department, and that HR department would do usual things like, appraisals at the end of the year, process salaries, wages. They will look at, grievances and things like that. But when it comes to managing aspects in terms of career aspirations, when you look at their growth within the organization and the kind of significant input they have into the business, that is where the management then directs the HR to say that we need to micromanage this particular person because this person is important for the business and this person's contribution to the business is important. And that is where you get to see, if we pick up a company like Apple, just to stay with Apple as an example in this discussion, you see the chief executive officer is supported by a number of senior vice presidents. So somewhere on the software division, somewhere on hardware, somewhere on design, somewhere in retail, sales, marketing. And these tend to form key pillars of the organization, because at some stage, one of them would either step into the COO role or the CEO role. And that is where the involvement of management becomes important, is because they clearly identify that individual and want the talent management team or the team in HR to actually ensure that this person, is earmarked for certain responsibilities or, growth within the organization because of the contribution it makes. Now, the second aspect that we look at is we look at things like employer branding through differentiation. So here, what will happen is that different people within the organization contribute differently. Some of them would be contributing quantitatively, some of them would be contributing qualitatively. So when we look at support positions like administration, when we look at support positions which are primarily like HR or, other departments like finance, accounts, here, what will happen is they are not directly related to maybe increasing the revenue or achieving the target of the organization, but their function in terms of supporting that achievement is quite significant. So here also, when we look at managing talent, it's a different form of a challenge wherein the employee has to be gauged on qualitative factors in terms of contributions to the company's objective, and that is where you will see that sometimes employers would look at differentiation, and some of the goals and targets in which the measurements are happening are done differently for different people working in different departments. Now, the next thing that we look at in terms of one of the factors would be when we talk about balancing global needs and local needs. Now, sometimes you will see that even though the company is expanding, they have a very experienced person within the team. They end up hiring somebody local to be able to run that side of the business. They might have an expat who will basically go in and oversee the operations and everything. But at a later stage, the direct driving of the business or the control of the business in that location would be somebody who is primarily from that region or that location, has local knowledge, has inroads and connections into maybe the government, the say for example the political setup, or is very well aware of the commercial requirements of how the business needs to be done. So here, sometimes you will see that they have to acquire a person from outside. That means they have to recruit somebody from outside. And this is where they need to look at that if we have a local person who's heading the organization, then he might be able to command maybe more respect and more get more done in terms of the objectives. If we have somebody who's outside from that location, might not be able to, it'll take time to build that rapport and obviously, get that objective going. So sometimes they have to look at managing, local needs, which is where the sourcing of, a new person could also happen. And that then brings us nicely into the point, which is, how do we ensure that the person in that position is actually the most suited person to be able to run that particular organization or that setup. And that is where the cultural side of things come in, because you need to be, you need to have somebody who's local, is aware of the culture, the nuances of the business, the environment, and has some inroads or insights into how the business needs to be developed in that location. So sometimes you will see that, large multinational companies, when they look at opening operations in a particular location, they choose a person from the local setup who has been working within the market, as well known, and is maybe much better suited to run that side of operations than bringing in somebody or transferring somebody from the head office who will be taking time to basically set up and start up and obviously get going. Now, some of these things, when we look at, also look at alignment with the overall strategy of what the organization is actually trying to achieve. And this sometimes, if it is not aligned, so when we discussed yesterday, talent management strategy, because it looks at the long-term view of how succession planning or how people will move into, say, how they will be promoted, how the appraisals will happen, how the promotions will be done, and how they will step into senior positions or take up more roles and responsibilities. And when we look at that, that is basically alignment with the organizational strategy, because that person or that professional has been identified as a key person contributing, making a significant contribution to the institution or the organization, and that is where his growth is also important within the organization as that person or that professional brings in more maybe income or revenue into the organization. So alignment with strategy, and if it does not happen, then what tends to happen is you will see that you have somebody who's quite aggressive, quite outgoing, quite able to get the business, but because the expectation of that individual has not been met, or is not the organization is not able to meet the expectation of that individual ends up leaving the organization because he or she is then seeking opportunities which are more available outside the organization, and he feels that his contributions are not valued enough. And that is why you sometimes see that if this talent management strategy is not matched with the organizational strategy at some level, you will see some internal consistency not happening, which means that the individual will end up leaving the organization. So sometimes you see that some CEOs of the organization end up leaving prematurely, even if they have contracts or terms which have been put in place for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. You see that happening more predominantly with the football clubs. I mean, took up an example of Jose Mourinho's exit from Manchester United, and this is where what happens is that he obviously was brought in after Alex Ferguson, and a lot of due diligence was done that he would be a well-suited manager to step into the shoes of Sir Alex Ferguson. And that at that point in time, when the management, the board took a decision, they felt that it will align with the club's strategy of bringing the best talent in. If you have the best manager, then we will be able to retain or win trophies and win obviously more trophies, and that success will continue. But because the alignment and because of the inconsistency related to the person not being able to manage the club well, and having given 2.5 years in terms of time, the person ends up leaving. The club still ends up paying a bit of a bill, because they have prematurely kind of terminated the contract. They have not given him enough time. So in some cases, when we look at this as an example, you will see that the alignment, they brought in Mourinho, and there's a lot of talk now that he is more self-centered in terms of a person. It's more about his style of management of the team rather than what the club stands for, what the board wants, and how the team wants to play out when they're out in the field. So lots of analysis which has been pouring in because this was initially the strategy which the board would have put forward and kind of signed up on when they brought him in, because he spent 400 million in terms of buying 11 players across a period of 2.5 years, and that has not resulted in them winning the Premier League, English Premier League, in the last 2.5 years. So that means a lot of money has gone, a lot of money has been invested, and they have now realized after a bit of a review that this strategy of alignment with this person is not working, and an exit seems the only option, which is where, in order to have this inconsistency going forward, they want to, obviously they fired him, and they want to bring in somebody who is going to be loyal on the principles and morals of what the club stands for and is able to, drive it further. So sometimes the acquisition of talent, leading up to the management of talent, and then retaining into the organization becomes difficult because some of these things cannot be prejudged, and over a point in time, some of these things, when they come out as inconsistencies, the strategy has to be realigned, and that realignment typically tends to happen, which can be expensive or costly for the organization because you end up paying severance packages or contracts which still have to be honored because they were signed in, and because the company or the organization is actually firing the employee. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. The next thing that we look at, if we go into a bit more detail in terms of how this process is managed, at a global scale. The reason why we say this is when we look at human resources and we look at planning, we see this happening day in, day out in small, medium, large organizations. But nowadays, it's become very important for organizations like Facebook, Microsoft, Google. You look at all these companies which are basically human resources oriented. LinkedIn, most people working within the organization, most employees are basically programmers. They're technical people. Now, in order to manage them and retain them in the company, it is important for them to be able to, look at understanding what makes them tick. What are the key things they require? What are the key things they should have, which brings out the best in terms of their performance, which actually looks at keeping them loyal to the organization, which actually looks at keeping them motivated in their role or the day-to-day responsibilities that they execute or the things that they do. And this concept, when we look at from these resource intensive organizations, which have a lot of people working on different things within the organization, we look at this particular concept of something called the integrated talent management. Now here, everything goes hand in hand. So when we look at a company like Facebook employing a lot of engineers, they have engineers based everywhere in the world. Now, because they work remotely, sometimes you will see that the HR has to do a lot of planning, which basically looks at having a number of resources they recruit in a particular location because they feel that this part of the project can be done quite smoothly, quickly, and the right resources that we need are predominantly present in this particular country or this region. Then you look at the process of recruiting. So Facebook has a lot of employees. The case in point and the example that I would give is when they look at workforce planning, they look at bringing out a new thing. Like, for example, they introduced the Facebook Messenger. They changed the timeline in the last 3 years, how Facebook depicts the information on the user's account in terms of a timeline. In order to roll this out, because they had a lot of users, 1.2 billion users, and in order to roll this out without having a disruption in the service, they wanted to look at a lot of engineers to be recruited, which would understand the system and work on it parallelly while the service was still live. Now, this workforce planning was done that they said, okay, we do not have this resource or this talent present in Americas. We have to go to a country like India, wherein you'll have access to software engineers, and access, when I meant, was about 6,000 to 7,000 engineers. So when they looked at workforce planning, they said, okay, in order to roll this new project out, they must have been working on this for a couple of years. And I'm making this up because I don't know exactly how it worked out. But as an example, when you look at this change, which they brought across in the presentation of information, must have been approved by the management 6, 8, 9, 10, 12 months in advance. And when the planning started to happen, they looked at identifying resources, which area they can find, which country they can find. They decided to open up in India, and then that is where they hired 6,000 engineers. The recruitment process got underway. Once the recruitment was done, they had them. The next process was onboarding. Onboarding means they were made familiar with Facebook's terms and conditions. Contracts were issued. Employee inductions were done, and they were given job descriptions, which basically meant that along with key areas, key result areas, measurement KRAs, that okay, once you start work, this is what are the expected results, and this is what you are expected to work on. Now, a lot of managers were put into place to basically look at managing the performance. When I say managing, that means on a daily basis ensuring that this much code is written, this piece of work is tested, the code is tested, and things like that. And that on a day in, day out, weekly, monthly, quarterly, 6 monthly basis leads to something called performance management. So that means the people are given a job, they complete the job is reviewed, and that review typically tends to happen with the manager, and that is where the performance management, as an aspect comes in. Now, if they feel that the engineer is not performing or the person is not performing to the required objectives, they identify gap areas, things like, okay, the person might not have knowledge about a programming language or might not understand a programming piece of code within Facebook's, overall strategy. So internal trainings are drafted, and the people or the engineers are then required to do internal trainings to bring them up to speed with the knowledge required to work on the project. Once that is done, you will see that some people within the teams were able to, get on with the job, were able to perform, excel, and that is where, after a point in time, when reviews happen, when appraisals happen, what tends to happen is they get promoted. That promotion means that the positions that they make vacant, again, recruitment needs to happen in those positions, and when they go into a senior position, they look at, creation of teams, and these creation of teams essentially ensures that, the project keeps moving forward. But when you get promoted, you expect, what do you expect? You expect maybe a rise in salary. You expect that you'll get some more compensation and benefits, because promotion comes with more responsibilities. And when you have more responsibilities, you're looking at getting more in return, from your employer. So compensation and benefits are put in place. And this is something which the company has written into some sort of an employee code, that they have some levels of hierarchy. Most organizations, when we look at, they have, S1, S2, or E1, E2, E3, and go up to level 10. That means somebody who's at the junior most level is at E1, and somebody who is at the senior most level, maybe the CEO, is at E10 in terms of a hierarchy. And then the compensation, the reward system, mechanism for approval, the performance appraisals, job descriptions are all written, by the HR department, and then these are implemented when people move from one position to the other. Now, before you get promoted, before you get the opportunity to apply internally to, look at applying for different positions, you will see that sometimes, the organizations which are recruiting technical manpower, especially engineers, or when you look at engineering organizations, they look at, they understand you have degree and the relevant, knowledge, but what they also look at doing is they ask you to undertake certain specific tests. And these are tests which are done primarily related to what is the job description required. So when you look at, when a company like Facebook, say, looks at recruiting programmers, they always end up doing a test at some stage, because this test will actually test their skills and competency at that level. Having said that I have this knowledge, or I can do programming in Python or Visual C or any other language they require, does not mean anything to them, because what they need to be able to do is see the proof of the pudding, and that is where they undergo certain sort of tests during the recruitment and selection process. So might not happen in the first phase, but in companies like Facebook, LinkedIn, which are people joining at the programming level, the first thing that they get shortlisted for is, once the CV shortlisted, can you come in and undergo a few tests? So they want to see how you code, how you basically look at adapting to the code, and if that is something that you go past, then what they do is they take you to the process of further the process of recruitment and selection. So in some cases, when employees are part of that organization and they still find that there are gaps which are there, or the things which you still haven't had access to after training and development, the gap areas are identified, and that is where the HR manager, along with the person who manages the talent pool within a project team, will actually say that, okay, hang on, this person is quite good, is quite relevant, but he does not have skill in this key area. So can we look at putting him into a team wherein his current skills can be put to the best use without affecting the nature of the project, or without affecting the overall progress of the project. So this particular bit, when you look at managing the talent and also managing the HR functions of it, are very keenly integrated into the concept of talent management. And you cannot say that one takes more priority over the other, but it follows a sequential kind of a pattern, wherein you will see that at some stage, it starts off with a bit of planning, and at some stage it leads to compensation and benefits, again identifies gap and critical skill through the analysis of gaps, and then again this then gets put forward to for example, in this case, after a gap has been identified, you again will point that employee back to the place wherein the performance has to be improved, and that is where what will happen is that they will be asked to do further training. In some cases, if they find that there are permanent gaps in that skill and that is not leading to the output which the person is at, you will see that the person gets demoted or is asked to work in a different project wherein maybe that project might not pay that well, and in those cases, you will see the compensation and benefits of that person gets affected. If they still see that there are gaps in analysis which cannot be covered even after training, development, and putting that person into a different role, then you will fire the person. Here, the person will exit the organization, and you will see that in order to replace that talent, the HR will start looking at recruiting. Now, if they feel the person has been out of work or has been on paternity leave, maternity leave, and in some cases, you will see that the performance is an issue, then the person will be given an opportunity to look at improving the performance, will be given training and support, and that would lead to him meeting the requirements. If not, then what tends to happen again, the person can be thrown out of the organization, and again the HR will go back into something called recruiting. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So this process is all interconnected to a certain extent, because at some stage, if you see a person becomes too cock-headed in the sense that, okay, I'm the only one who's driving this project, and without me nothing can happen, and if the person refuses to take a senior role or a role wherein it's a supporting role, then in that case also the HR could fire that person and go back straight into recruitment, which would mean they would hire somebody who will project manage that for the interim time being, and at some stage they will have somebody who will step into the shoes from within the team, and that will go forward. Now, in terms of understanding, what are the key barriers which are there when you try and manage talent, when you try and manage people within the organization. The first challenge which most HR managers have is when the fancy descriptions are made, the job descriptions are made by the department heads that I need this person with this quality or this skill. They have the first objection or the barrier that they get is that, you've given me 10 CVs, but none of the CVs actually match the description which I have given, or match the job description which has been created. So here, one of the key challenges that you have as an HR manager is in this bit is, how do you recruit what is required within the organization? That means it matches 100% of the job description. Sometimes you do an interview, you feel that the person or the candidate has about 80% of what we require, 90% of what we require, but not really 100%. And you go through a number of candidates, but at some stage you decide that, okay, we are not going to look at taking anybody with 60, 70, 80%. We're looking at a 100% match. And that is where sometimes recruitment for a particular position, becomes difficult. It's easy to explain using an example that if a company is looking for a chief executive, they would not want somebody who has 50, 60, 70% or 80% of the knowledge or the requirement meeting criteria of the job description, but they want somebody who fits that job description 100%. So they wouldn't want to compromise. And sometimes that is why you see that this process of recruitment takes 6, 8, 10, 12, even 2 years, 3 years, when the organization is not able to find the suitable person to be able to drive that, forward. So recruitment is a big challenge.
Okay.
When I say it's a challenge, it is a key barrier. Sometimes you have positions which are open with the organizations for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year, because they're not able to recruit or find somebody suitable enough to come and work in that position. Now, the second most important bit is sometimes when you look at high-performing individuals, people who are performing at the top end of their game, they have the information, they have the knowledge, they have the experience, they have the skills, and sometimes when you ask them, you identify areas where they need improvement, they need training, it becomes difficult for the HR to say that, okay, you need to attend this training event. So in some cases, when you see, let me put up an example, for example, when you look at the HR department itself, Now, sometimes you will see the HR department within that, if they have a training and learning and development manager, L&D manager, person who's responsible for learning and development within the organization. If you see that person does not get the opportunity to do a lot of trainings because he's understood to have this as a key area or as a key field. So this person is responsible for training and development, but this person ironically is not put into any training and development programs, because you are supposed to manage it, you are supposed to do it for others, but not for yourself. So sometimes it becomes difficult and it becomes a barrier because these people who work on these plans do not have time enough for themselves to be able to put themselves into training, or look at doing further training to improve what they already teach, or what they essentially deliver in the organization. So sometimes training and development of the talent becomes difficult because of the nature in which or the nature of the department in which they are working, and that is where this could be a barrier. Now there are several other barriers, things like retaining talent. Sometimes you will see that people who are not happy within the organization, they end up resigning suddenly or abruptly. Now the HR then tends to find out what are the reasons why you want to leave. Sometimes you will see that they give very silly reasons that I do not get on with my boss, or in some cases they say that I do not find the job to be interesting, or the work that I'm doing is repetitive, and that is where they decide that, okay, I want to end up leaving because this is something that is not exciting enough or motivating enough for me to do. So in those cases, there are two things which have happened. One is the HR and the line manager has failed to recognize that this is a routine or a pattern which is setting in and which is demotivating the person working in that role. And the second thing is that they have not provided adequate opportunities for either training and development or job rotation, and that is where it is becoming difficult, and they do not have any answers for any positive reasons for sharing, because of which the person is able to either change the decision or decide that okay, I'm not going to leave, but with a change of responsibility or a change of job role, I will still continue to work within the organization. So retaining talent becomes an important issue or a barrier specifically in managing this, is because sometimes you will also see that an organization, your competitors are also seeking out the same individuals, and they are willing to offer higher emoluments or salary or wage packages, which attracts the already existing person within the organization, because he sees that, okay, if I stay here, I will not get this much growth, but if I switch over the job to another company or a competitor, I might be, I'm getting a better salary or a higher salary and a better position or a higher position, and that is where retaining that talent, becomes, kind of a barrier for, when we look at HR in particular. Now, there are other factors which I'll explain very briefly, like when you look at developing leadership in terms of talent. Now, in order for organization to identify and shortlist and identify, people who get into leadership positions is quite important. Now, if they feel that they do not have a talent pool or enough resources in terms of key people within the organization who are capable of getting into this role, then at some stage they have to look at bringing people from outside who will be able to manage or, provide leadership. So sometimes you will see that developing, leadership within the organization is also a barrier, because they do not have many individuals who can actually, step into that role.
Wow.
Other things that we see in terms of, other barriers would be things like, sometimes you see if you bring the head of the organization from outside a particular country or from a different location, who's not well versed with the culture, or is not well versed with the employees who are working within that side of the organization, you see this as a bit of a barrier. They have no choice. Somebody has left abruptly, but they have no choice to bring in somebody from outside to, in the interim role, to be able to manage that. And that could also be a barrier at times, which brings the productivity or the, output of the organization down. Now, we also see technology to a certain extent becoming a barrier, because a lot of old, when I say old hands, a lot of people who have been working within this field for a number of years, the digital side of things which have started to happen, things like, the SAP, when you look at a SAP module for HRM, which is available, it pretty much, people struggle with working on software or, understanding new software packages within the organization. That kind of hampers, the performance or the productivity of the HR department. So that you will see that some people who are not aware of this, technological upgrades which are now being applied in terms of HR, in terms of better managing the information then leading to creation of reports which can be accessed by the senior management to take decisions, and that is where it also tends to be a bit of a barrier. Now, one of the concepts that we've seen over the years which has evolved within organization is coaching and mentoring. And coaching and mentoring is done with employees within the organization because they feel that these people, if given the right amount of supervision and given the right amount of experience, can step into positions which will, be good for the organization. So when you see that a person has been, a case in point or example here is that a person has been working as a general manager, say, for 20 years. Now, he hasn't seen any growth in terms of either his role, responsibility, or his designation or title in the organization. For 20 years, he's worked well. He's not been, he's been rewarded in terms of maybe pay rises and things like that, but has not managed to grow in terms of the organization. Say, for example, when I say grow is, has not become a vice president or a senior person or a part of the member of the management. But here, that to an organization would mean that the person has not been able to do it is because the person has not got the right opportunities or the right direction to be able to move into the higher role or position. It could be several reasons. If I look at it, one, the person is complacent enough. He's happy with where the person is, and he doesn't want any more responsibility. And he says, okay, I'm happy in this role. I'm content, and I consent with staying in this role because of the fact that I don't want more responsibility or more headaches in some cases. Now, the other aspect would be that in some cases, the person has not had an access to go into a senior position because his boss has not left the organization or somebody is already in that position, and because of which he cannot get into his role. The third aspect could be that in some cases, the organization itself has not grown enough in terms of operations or revenue, sales, whatever it is, and that has meant that people do not have the the flexibility to look at getting promotions every year or every 3 years and 5 years. So it tends to be long term, and the long term perspective is where if somebody leaves the organization, then only they will get the opportunity to step into that role. So from that aspect, what some organizations then do is they look at coaching and mentoring. So in coaching and mentoring, what they do is they basically look at aligning that person with somebody senior in the organization who takes them under their wings or under them in terms of owning that person to be able to pass on information, knowledge, skills, experience, so that at some stage when they are looking at moving on, that person will step into their role. And that particular process is differentiated from coaching, wherein coaching is temporary, mentoring is short term, mentoring is long term. Coaching is done primarily for you to gain a particular skill, and once you have done that, you gain that skill or that particular information, you can work on your own. But in mentoring, you're consistently being monitored and supervised to be able to step into the role or look at taking up that position, and this tends to be more of long term. So they look at this particular as a process which is a long term process, and this sometimes can be a barrier. So a lot of people who have been working within the organization for a number of years do not want that opportunity of coaching and mentoring, because they say, okay, I know enough, I have enough knowledge, I have enough experience, I've got the things required. All I need is an opportunity to get into this role, which I'm not getting. So, this tends to be potentially a bit of a barrier. Now, having said that, one of the other points is that, diversity, which is workforce diversity, which is a key aspect in human resources today, could also be a barrier, because sometimes law, legislation, regulation in a particular geography or in a particular country tends to be a bit of a barrier because like in the UK, you have a minimum wage, which has to be given. That kind of forces all employers to employ people at that particular minimum wage, and that in some countries might not be present, but in some countries, allows for, compliance, which has to be done when companies are operating within that geography. Otherwise, they're seen to be as offenders and could be fined. So that could increase the cost or overheads for the company, but, in a way, they have to follow it when they look at, taking new people on, and that minimum wage has to be paid and no discrimination can be done. And this means that, this is something which could be a barrier for startup businesses or organizations which are setting up operations and want to keep costs low but can't do it because of the fact that whether they employ skilled, semi-skilled or unskilled person in that location or that job, they still have to pay the basic minimum wage pay, and that is where their priorities tend to be decided, wherein it could be one of them is a barrier as far as this is concerned. Now, how do we manage, let's look at those barriers. So if you look at managing barriers, these barriers could pose challenges which could be short-term, long-term for the organization. And some of the challenges that, managers face when they try and manage this is that how do we attract, high-quality candidates when you're recruiting people? How do you get the right candidate? When I say right, sometimes you put a job out, the HR receives 200 CVs. But out of the 200 CVs, when they do a keyword search, they only find 10 or 15 to be relevant. Out of that, they do a shortlist. They still get maybe 2 or 3, but they still not end up recruiting that person because they feel that the person does not have the right knowledge of the skills which are required, in this particular role as per the job description. So sometimes organizations, when they're looking out for person or people or professional, they find it difficult to find the right talent or candidates which have the same experience which is required to, kind of jumpstart that function within the organization. And a simple example is, you will normally see in McDonald's or, most of these businesses like Subway and others, sometimes you will see that for certain specific positions, they have to recruit people which have prior knowledge. So somebody who's going to work with, ovens and, look at making the food, they need to have basic qualities of being, having some certification on, handling food, handling products, but at the same time also being able to operate the machinery and the plant or the equipment which is present in a particular store. And that is where they want people with a specific certification, a specific number of years of experience. And sometimes you find it difficult to find, that person with that experience because there are not enough candidates available. So they cannot experiment or, take somebody on irrespective of the fact. So they have to look at, either changing the location of the restaurant or, the place where it is being opened because they do not find sufficient manpower, which is required to be able to run that operation. Now, other factors typically include things like, how do you look at retaining the people? How do you look at, ensuring that when you have people within the organization, they are engaged and they are focused on the tasks which are required to be done? And how much is too much in terms of compensation? This also needs to be looked at. And sometimes, the organization will decide that, okay, in terms of compensation or benefits, we'll pay this much only. Now, if you find a candidate, we find it. If we don't, then, we'll keep looking for it. But this sometimes tends to be a barrier that we're trying to recruit a person and you're trying to look at attracting talent from your competitors or from the market, but you're not paying enough, and the candidates like that they want to work for the company, they want to come in and work and things like that. But because you're not paying enough, what tends to happen is this tends to be a barrier for these companies to be able to get, quality employees or manpower, which is required in that particular position, location, or the organization for them to work. So these are some of the barriers that you will see are there, which HR managers or people essentially who work as talent managers actually grapple with when they look at challenges. Now we look at the last aspect of how global mobility is, creating challenges for global talent management. Now here, what we basically want to look at is that sometimes you will see business executives, they need, what I would suggest is they need, say, for example, certain specific type of people working within their teams. If I look at giving an example, a project manager, when he's been appointed as a project manager, he or she actually needs specific type of individuals to work within his organization. That is the project management organization. So he would need people who understand risk, security. He would need people who understand scheduling. He would need people who understand, timekeeping. He would need people who understand progress, which can be made on a daily basis. That's how the project is going to be completed. He needs people who clearly know that some of the aspects of the project are going to be mission critical, and those will have to be achieved, on that day, irrespective of the number of hours they have to spend in terms of the time. Now, when you look at that, sometimes you will see that when the project manager gives across the requirement after being recruited for that project manager might see that he is not able to get, the right kind of people. So in those cases, what they do is they look at people from outside that location to be able to bring people in from outside. And that is where they have to kind of struggle with sometimes looking at things like visas or, looking at barriers which come in, sometimes which do not incentivize the individual to, transfer over or come and work for a particular, in a particular project. A case in point that I will give here is, for example, when you look at a lot of developed countries are trying to attract people which are highly skilled. So what they look at is they bring out a skill list every 3, 4, 5 years, and they want those type of people to only apply and come in for immigration into that country. So when you look at the UK, for example, they look at people like doctors, analysts, accountants. They look at people who are in very senior positions within certain types of businesses, which are e-commerce, businesses which are related to healthcare. And those are the type of individuals they want to attract to be able to come in to UK to work. Now, if the organization is not able to find a suitable person from within the same, geography, they end up going national. But if they can't find the person or the people required for the project within the UK, they end up advertising abroad. So first they go to EU, and then after that they go abroad. But when you look at this particular process from abroad, you will see that there are lots of other hindrances which are there, which basically mean that, in a global village, the company is free to hire and fire, learners or professionals that they want from any place in the world. But sometimes you will see the government then puts levies, which basically ensure that you are forced to look at recruiting somebody from the same region or from the same country rather than go abroad and look for that resource, because the government is looking at, let's put it this way, penalizing businesses if they look. So from that aspect, what you will see is that sometimes this affects global mobility. So in short, visas, in short, things which the government law and legislation will come in, that would basically affect global mobility. Now, sometimes you will see organizations are able to transfer employees internationally, and this transfer of employees happening internationally allows the companies to kind of override the legislation or restrictions which the local government is able to put or the national government is able to put in terms of mobility of the talent. Now, one such example, which I will give is, say, for example, companies in the US require H-1B visas to transfer employees within the company. And these visas are quite restrictive. So when you look at these visas which are restricted, that means there's a limit to the number of visas which can be granted to the firm. They are quite sought after. So here you will see that sometimes the companies need local resources, but they also need their own employees from a different location to come in and work, and they find it difficult to find employees within a particular geography, like in the US, and they have to employ people from outside. And here the regulation from the government becomes a bit of a barrier towards mobilities, because the number of visas which the company can get or for intra-company transfer of employees, specifically in the US, like H1B visas, tend restricting global mobility. So here, sometimes the challenges are that the companies, come together, they discuss and ask the government to look at a policy or make a change in the policy in order for them to, ensure that they are able to have relevant people within the organizational setup to be able to work with. Now, there are other, drivers which basically look at, global mobilities, which include things like if a company acquires another company or an operation in a geography. So here they have the ability to be able to acquire a lot of talent, but then at some stage, there are lots of redundancies which also tends to happen within the organization because they feel that, okay, this is somebody which which we already have in the function and can manage it. So sometimes you will see when one business acquires other businesses and they amalgamate or come together, it leads to a lot of redundancies, which means that in some locations, you will feel that the company let go of employees because they have already that function person working within a particular role and they do not want to duplicate that role. So here, what we understand is that sometimes when you look at global mobility, there are various reasons which organizations look at to move people. Now, one such example which I'll give you is if you have people working within an organization which have been loyal, motivated, and have worked for 20, 30, 40 years, what the organization sometimes does is it basically transfers the employee onto an overseas location to manage that business as an incentive. So here, their main aim of providing that person with an opportunity is in terms of retaining the individual within the organization. And because the person has been loyal, has been able to deliver every time on the targets or the organizational objectives, as an incentive, they transfer the person over to another location to manage the business, which seems to be giving them a bit of an independent responsibility. So again, this concept of global mobility then comes into places because the organization has that ability to be able to transfer employee to another location or another area of business, and that is where you see this as a option which tends to happen when we look at the organization. Now, some of the other points which are highlighted on the slide include things like flexible repatriation. When sometimes when you look at companies, take other companies, they look at repatriating employees, to ensure that they also have significant, basically they have roles and responsibilities within the organization rather than making them redundant. And sometimes you will see the companies look at doing assessment, of employees to ensure that they are fit for the right job. And in some cases, they find that, okay, if that particular job role is not available within the organization or in this particular location, they transfer those employees to a different location. And that also, looks at global mobility. Now, over the years, what we've seen is that some of the organizations which are quite, as I mentioned earlier, have lots of resources, which is people in terms of resources. They tend to manage these pipelines or create pipelines, wherein they look at this process of systematic job rotation, systematic rotation of employees across geographies. And this is seen as an example in the case of, large organizations. And they are done from various reasons. Let's look at an example of Microsoft. Now, Microsoft has operations in, say, over 60 countries. What they tend to do is people work within a geography, and have good experience now, but they are also valuable as an asset to the organization. Microsoft will move them from one geography or area of operation within their business into another geography or another country to get more experience in that operation, because they feel that the person is able to create success within that area, and that same success can be replicated in another geography which they require or another area of business they require. So they tend to kind of rotate people across different locations, different functions, and this then tends to give them experience, knowledge, skill, and information which is required to better manage the responsibility when they are given at a later point in time. So this helps in doing 3-4 things. One, it serves as an incentive for the person performing well to be given an international opportunity to go abroad and, be there for a number of years and, obviously learn new skills and put some of the, skills and experience that they have gained in that location into work so that it can become a success. First point is incentive. The second point is they look at training that as a person to be able to take up senior responsibility, because you worked in America, you worked in a particular location in the UK, then you've been transferred after a number of years to France, and the idea is the idea of moving you into different locations is also to give you a flair of the different areas of business and how this business allows you to gain skills, which means that as a person, you're being groomed or trained to take up a future position, of a leader within the organization. The third thing would be that the organization is looking at building experience at your end. So when you look at people within Europe, for example, they manage businesses within UK first. At some stage, they are they are given responsibility to manage Ireland and UK and I, it is called. And at some stage, when they manage the UK and I or UK and Ireland side of businesses, they are also given the opportunity in terms of promotion, and they become, say, a senior vice president, and you manage business within Western Europe. So you look after 3, 4, 5 countries. So it is an opportunity given by the organization under mobility for you to gain experience as an incentive to, learn obviously new skills, and also at the same point in time, train you as a leader to take up a future role within the organization. So global mobility of resources, when we look at under talent management, has a lot of different connotations. It could be for incentives, it could be for gaining experience, it could be for, repatriation. When I say that in terms of mergers and acquisition, it could be for looking at, basically grooming you up for taking up leadership positions. And last but not the least, it could be because your talent and your experience is required in a particular geography by the organization to achieve a particular objective. So you might be sent or transferred over, to a particular location for a certain point of time, wherein they could utilize your expertise and then obviously, run or, obviously better manage that business. So lots of different functions of mobility, and, that is where sometimes you see that organizations take decisions to move employees intra-company transfer in order to look at, retaining you within the organization. If you're doing quite well, there's no vacancy, there's no scope for promotion, they might decide you to transfer over to a new country or a location as an incentive to work. And this then keeps you within the organization rather than you having to leave. Now, let's look at one of the other things is what is the role of global mobility? So when we say, just summarizing here very briefly, what we've discussed in the previous 2 slides is that sometimes you see that, deployment, when a company takes up a new challenge or takes up a new assignment, if you're working within an engineering firm, which gets a new project or a tender to, say, manufacture a few bridges and things like that, I think sometimes they have to collect and collate teams which understand the culture, they understand the background, the business, the strategic objectives, and also are sometimes well versed with the local geography in which they're going to be working. So deployment is done, or selection of manpower from within the company is done basis the suitability for deployment. That means they are aware of the culture, they are aware of the objectives, they have background in terms of, having worked in similar projects. And that is where, sometimes you will see that these are things which companies look at when they look at deployment. And these are, when I say, the key factors which we looked at in the slide, when they look at, managing the talent, these inner factors, when we look at companies making decisions to move people over from one location to the other, these are the 5, biggest myths that we see that HR would see or, would come up as objections to say, okay, we need a better person to work in this location who is understanding of the culture and things like that. And that one of the reasons is, okay, he's not from this geography, he's not from this country, he's not from this particular location. So deployment tends to be a particular, myth. The second bit is when you look at assigning employees from a home country, you see that, okay, I want to go global, but I want local people to work for the business. But the irony is that they still bring in a lot of people from their own organization under intercompany transfers. and they look at, the exploiting the region of global mobility. So here again, you see that when we took up the example of H-1B visas in the US, a lot of companies, tend to move employees to different location under the pretext of incentive experience, things like that. But the real reason not being the requirement of that resource or requirement of that expertise to work in that location. When I said incentives, send the employees and sort everything later, look at the matrix of, their ROI. Sometimes they look at managing cost heads. They say, okay, this particular new project, we have a budget of this, so we need to look at those many employees and beyond which we cannot go. So sometimes they're related to saying that, okay, the ROI of the project can only be managed if we have people, from the local population or, from the local side, rather than transferring over employees from, one geography to the other. Taxation is another myth. And then last but not the least, we look at, companies spending a lot of money on business visas, which means that they are not based in that location, but they're temporarily based in that location because of the visa facility which is available. And a lot of people, they tend to do a lot of trips every month, every 2 months, in order to run the operation. So that is where the organizations, at some stage, the HR has to say that, okay, this is not viable because we have an employee traveling so many times, but it will be better off if the company recruits somebody locally to be able to better manage that as a project or, or review the project or whatever it is. And in those cases, you see, this is one of the myths which actually comes across, under when we look at, mobility with regards to moving people across different geographies by the organization. Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
Now, in this second learning outcome, what we need to understand are two key things. First thing, how and what. So first thing is, what are the factors which actually are required to manage, talent? And this slide, give you that particular option, the information. The second thing that we need to understand is why we need to manage talent and what are the contributions or, what are the barriers, challenges which come when companies on a large scale or on a global scale need to manage people. And those barriers and challenges is what we need to understand in the second context. So once you know that what are the key challenges which are required, the key factors which are required to manage people within large companies and geographies, then we need to look at barriers and we need to look at challenges. Okay. Now, the handout which I sent to you yesterday evening actually has information on this which you could go through, and that will give you more understanding in terms of slides that we've covered today.
Okay, I will.
Any questions on this so far?
No, not at all. I'll try to digest this very well we can. If I have any questions, I'll let you know.
That's fine. So my suggestion would be to go through the slide and go through the handouts which I've sent. And if you still have questions, then we will pick them up, next week. But tomorrow we are going to look at understanding in a bit more detail about what is the impact of globalization on, talent management. Why is it becoming easier for people to travel, migrate, and, take up jobs and positions because the world has become a global village. And the other thing would be how what we'll do is we'll understand with a particular example of what happens if somebody ends up leaving the organization and the organization has not put a plan in place for succession. What are the key things which could affect that organization? So we will understand the impact of, sudden exit of management from the organization. And if the succession planning has not been done, then how does it affect, the leadership? How does it affect the organization?
Okay, we're doing that tomorrow, right?
Yeah, we're doing that tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, take care. Thank you for joining the session today. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. But are you going to send me the handout and the recording session for today?
Yes, I've sent you the same. This presentation is having the same, thing that we discussed yesterday also.
Yesterday, okay.
It covers LO1 and LO2. If you see on Moodle also, I put that presentation in the 3 handouts, and this is what I emailed you specifically. So it covers both the discussions that we did yesterday and for today.
Today. Okay. Okay. Great.
LO1 covers this, and these are the two handouts.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.
Right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.